Hello, and thank you for joining me today. During today's webinar, I'll be talking about how to develop a system security plan. Now, while the agenda might look quite lengthy, we'll be sure to get you out of here in about 30 minutes. So today we'll talk about what a security plan is, or an SSP, what it is, why your organization should develop one, the requirements of an SSP, an approach to develop an SSP, who should be involved in that process, and I'll also describe and kind of demonstrate how to write a control implementation statement. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions and me to provide answers. So again, as I mentioned, we'll talk about how to develop an SSP and also how to write a control implementation statement. And one of the things we'd like for you to do, if interested, consider clicking on that QR code where you can download our white paper on NIST Special Publication 800-171. And there you see a screenshot of our white paper. So what is an SSP? What I provided here is the definition that NIST provides, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm not going to read that definition to you. As we go throughout the presentation, we'll see how we can dissect that definition to get a better understanding of what an SSP is and how to develop one. Now, the key takeaways from this definition are the SSP, it describes the system boundary. Now, the system boundary includes all of those IT components that are part of the system. That will be your servers, your workstations, your routers, switches, anything that stores, processes, or transmits controlled, unclassified information in your environment. Your SSP should also define the system operating environment, whether it's on premises or in the cloud or a hybrid. The SSP should also describe how your organization is meeting those security requirements. And also you want to include a discussion about any interconnections as related to how your system is connected internally to other systems or external systems. Now, why should you or your organization develop an SSP? We'll look at it from two perspectives. One, there's a business rationale. Now, for DoD contractors and aspiring DoD contractors, there's a business rationale. DFARS says that you must do it. Without an SSP, you will not get a DoD contract. This applies to prime contractors and also subcontractors. So it is critical that your organization develop an SSP. And there's also an operational rationale for doing so. For those of us in the field, we consider an SSP to be a living document. And it is an excellent tool for knowledge transfer. So when you have your SSP and somebody leaves your organization, anybody who picks up that responsibility, they have your security requirements right there in hand. So what are the requirements for an SSP? And we're going to go into a lot of details here. So first, you want to be sure to define the system components. And as I alluded to on the previous slide, that's going to be, like say, your servers, your workstations, any of your routers, your switches, any components within your environment that are involved in the processing and the storage or the transmission of your sensitive information. You also want to be sure to identify the types of information that the system will be processing, storing, transmitting. Your SSP should also discuss different types of threats to your particular organization. And you want to be sure to talk about the operational environment. Some organizations choose to do everything on premises, while others choose to deploy their operations to the cloud or a hybrid combination. And there are more requirements. The SSP should provide an overview of the security requirements for the system. Now here I'll just speak briefly about the difference between a requirement and a control. So the SSP, it will provide, or is supposed to provide, an overview of the security requirements. Now, NIST Special Publication 800-171 lists the requirements. Now, how you meet those requirements are called the controls, or as we talk about in the second bullet, the safeguards. So your SSP should describe those safeguards that you have in place or you plan to put in place to fulfill those security requirements. Now, a little discussion about the planned security requirements. In our next webinar, you'll hear more about it a little later on during this one. We'll be talking about a plan of how to develop a plan of action and milestones. So your SSP should talk about, one, the safeguards or controls you have in place today, and then also your plan in case you have any gaps. And in the event you have a plan, you want to be sure to create a plan of action and milestones. Your SSP should also discuss the personnel by name, their role, and their responsibility. So remember, as we said in the previous slide, that the SSP is a living document. So you want to make sure that SSP stays updated, and it captures personnel name, the role played, and also responsibilities. Another thing you want to keep in mind is you want to make sure that you include details regarding how you are protecting your CUI. You also want to make sure that you review and update the SSP on an organization-defined basis, at least annually. And you want to make sure that you protect the SSP from unauthorized disclosure. So what that means is everyone in your organization should not have access to your SSP, nor should you just share your SSP with other parties without a need to know. And clearly, I should have been clicking on my little mouse so you can get the different points there. So here's our approach to developing an SSP. First, you want to identify your stakeholders. That is everybody in your organization who has a role in providing security. Well, everybody has a role because all users. So let me retract that. You want to identify those stakeholders, such as your system owner. That is the person who's responsible for funding the system primarily and ultimately responsible for security of the system. You want to include any security personnel who are responsible for implementing a requirement. You also want to talk about HR, and you'll see a little bit about that in a subsequent slide. As mentioned earlier, you also want to identify the types of information that your organization processes, stores, and transmits, because the whole idea is to protect that information. In addition, you want to make sure that you kind of delineate the types of activities that can take place with CUI. So you do have CUI that you process. So you want to make sure that you identify those systems that process CUI. And it's not only you. It's even if you leverage a cloud service provider. So which CSPs help to process your CUI or your managed service providers. Similarly, storage. Where is your CUI stored? You want to make sure that you document those components that store CUI. And the same is true for transmitting and protecting CUI. Now, one thing of note here, as an organization, when you leverage a cloud service provider, you are still responsible for protecting that CUI, even though you kind of outsourced that service to that CSP or MSP. Ultimately, if there's a breach, you are responsible. And you also want to make sure that you identify all users who handle CUI. And it's a good rule of thumb to ensure that you implement something we call least privilege, and just ensure that only the required users who need access to CUI are the ones that are handling it. So continuing with our approach to developing an SSP, you want to make sure you identify the requirements that are applicable to your organization's system or environment of operation. So, for example, in NIST SP 800-171, there are controls related to media protection. How do you protect actual physical media? Um, but let's say that you have leveraged a cloud service provider such that you have um, no media that you operate or maintain. So that would mean that that requirement is not applicable to your organization. Now, in the SSP, you would annotate that requirement as being not applicable, but you want to make sure to include that rationale. And the reason you include that rationale, as I mentioned before, the SSP is a living document. It's good for knowledge transfer. So when somebody new joins the organization, they will understand why that requirement is not applicable. You also want to make sure that you conduct a gap analysis to find out which requirements you've met, which controls are, and which requirements are applicable. And then also you want to identify those requirements you have not met, because those are the ones, as we talked about earlier, and in the following bullet, for which you'll need a plan of action and milestones. So when you are conducting a gap analysis, is for a couple of reasons. One, to find out where you are, and then kind of develop that roadmap for down the line to ensure that you are making that you're accountable for documenting those controls. Now, a little later on in this presentation, I'll describe how to write a control implementation statement to meet one of the 800-171 requirements. And again, that's for anyone who is new. That's not 800, the number 800-171, which is not a number anyway, but it's for NIST special publication 800-171. And as I mentioned, for any of your gaps, you want to create a plan of action and milestones. And because what that will do is that will let everybody know who needs to know that there's a gap there and there's a plan to fulfill it. And as we mentioned in a subsequent webinar, we will discuss how to create a POAM. And lastly, be sure to securely store your SSP. Kind of treat your SSP like a password. You don't want to share it. Actually, it's not that sensitive. You don't share your password with anybody. But you can share the SSP with others, but just with those people who have a need to know. Now, there's often a question about who should be involved in when developing an SSP. Well, the following people should be involved when developing SSP. Any developers, because they know how they are developing the system to meet the different requirements. Any engineers who are configuring systems, and believe it or not, and HR personnel, if you're watching, yes, you should be involved too, because they're what we call personnel security controls. The information system security officers, they should be involved. Any sysadmins, architects, and certainly the system owner should be involved. So now, how to write a control implementation statement. I've selected control 3.1.8, which is related to unsuccessful logon attempts. And this comes from NIST SP 800-171, revision 3. So the first thing we want to do is to understand the requirement. And each of the 800-171 requirements has a requirement number. Well, let me not give you a sneak peek into the answer. So each one has a requirement number and it has a title. And like I said, we're looking at 3.1.8 and the requirement is unsuccessful logon attempts. Now in NIST SP 800-171, we have some very detailed requirements that must be met. This requirement is to enforce a limit of unsuccessful or invalid logon attempts by a user within a specified period of time. And then as an organization, your system must automatically do or execute one or more of the following options there. It must either lock the account or node for a period of time that you define. It must lock the account or node until an admin unlocks it. It must delay the next logon prompt, or it must notify system administrator or take some other action when the number of unsuccessful attempts is exceeded. Now, about this last bullet here, about the options you have, notice it says one or more. So you must select at least one. Now, many people ask, well, how many? Well, it depends on the risk that you decide when you perform your risk assessment. So now I'm going to show you an example of an implementation statement that meets this requirement. And ultimately, it is a control that the organization has implemented to fulfill the requirement. And what I've done is this is a scenario. So while you might see the IBSS access control policy, this is actually fictitious. So anybody that tries to hack us, our controls are implemented in this way. So you'd be wasting your time. All right. So if you notice that 3.1.8 does not mention anything about a policy. However, there's a requirement to enforce a limit. One of the things that we've learned from a governance perspective, it is always best to start with policy. So the fictitious IBSX access control policy, it states that all systems that process, store, or transmit CUI must lock out users who enter invalid logon credentials more than 3 times. That's number one. So if you notice here in the detailed requirement, it says enforce a limit of unsuccessful logon attempts. So IBSS has said 3. But then it says by a user during an organization defined period. IBSS says within 3 minutes or less. And then it says the IBSS system administrator configured the access control tool to disable a user's account if the user enters the incorrect login information. So what IBSS has chosen to do was we've selected one of the options over here, which is to disable the user's account. And notice on our list of options here, it does not say disable. However, our last option is to take another action. Okay, so as an organization, you have the flexibility to take another action, but ultimately you want to ensure that whatever control you develop and implement, that it does fulfill the requirements. So now we're at our questions and answers section, and I see that I already have a question over here in the chat. And the question is, when and how often should the SSP be updated? So I'm going to use a vague phrase, and then I'll kind of talk about it. Whenever there's been a substantial change in the control, and the substantial is relative, right? So my recommendation would be anytime that you have identified a control that needs to change, you should update your SSP. Whenever you have a personnel change, you should update your SSP. Because remember, we said that we want to make sure that our SSP includes the personnel by name, role, and responsibility. So in the event there's a situation where we need to know who is involved in an action, we want to make sure that SSP is up to date for that purpose. So anytime there's a personnel change, if you have a significant technology change, a control change, and I guess there are a host of others, but those are some good examples. Now, how often should it be updated? And I guess a good rule of thumb here is reviewed and updated. So at least annually, you want to make sure that you review an SSP at least annually, and depending upon your threat environment, more frequently. Now, another reason to update your SSP, let's say unfortunately you encounter or are the victim of an incident. You certainly want to kind of map the controls that are related to that incident and determine whether or not your controls were adequate, which might require an SSP update? That was a great question. So next question, who is responsible for maintaining and updating the SSP? So we think about a RACI chart. So you have responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Um, Depending upon the structure of organization, um, there's a role called the Information System Security Officer, or the acronym ISO. Quite often, that person is responsible for maintaining and updating the SSP. It could be somebody that you call the cybersecurity analyst, but they still require that same knowledge. But as far as ultimate, I guess I'll kind of change the question around. Who's accountable is a system owner, because the system owner is responsible for that system, and the system owner is responsible for identifying somebody who will maintain and update the SSP. So next question, what key metrics or indicators do you track to measure the effectiveness of the SSP in improving system security? Now, that's a great question. Um, First, I would say this: an organization wants to identify metrics, and a lot of organizations feel they're doing so. But one of the ways you know your SSP is effective is whether or not it meets compliance requirements. And that's just a yes or no, right? That's an indicator, because the question is what key metrics or indicators do you track to measure the effectiveness of the SSP? So let's say, for example, as a DoD contractor, CMMC is right around the corner, where you will have to demonstrate that your organization has controls in place to protect CUI, or control classified information. So let's say when you go through that CMMC 3PAO assessment, let's say you pass. Well, certainly that's a great indicator that your SSP is effective, but that's such a high level indicator. Um, Another indicator, and similar to, I guess, metrics used in for security operations. Let's say that your organization, you're tracking incidents, and your incidents are minimal. So you're measuring the number. That's what metrics are. So you're measuring the number of incidents, and let's say that you have um, just a few of those. We're not getting to an actual number now, but your security incidents, because a very well written SSP, you should be able to map it to your security operations. So you should be able to use those same metrics that you utilize for other aspects of security. Your SSP more so falls along the lines of your governance and compliance side of cybersecurity, whereas you have your security operations, security engineering. Those are other lines of business within cybersecurity. So you can actually use those same metrics there. You just want to make sure that you map your SSP to those. So, for example, let's say that you have your intrusion detection system, and it's actually mentioned in your SSP, and you have adequately documented how your intrusion detection system is detecting intrusions. So, if your IDS is configured properly, I'm not going to say properly, I want to pass judgment. If your IDS is configured in such a way that your organization is able to detect intrusions and act upon them, that suggests that your SSP is effective. I have another question. When aligning the system security plan with NIST SP 800-171, what do organizations most frequently struggle with, and how can small and medium-sized companies still achieve compliance with their limited resources? So I'm going to break that question up into two parts. So I'll restate the first part and then the second part. So when aligning their system security plan with NIST SP 800-171, what do organizations most frequently struggle with? I found that one of the greatest struggles is personnel. Um, to be able to properly document an SSP, it takes a combination of technical knowledge and writing skills. Um, Whoever is the author of the SSP, they need to have that technical knowledge. They need to be able to communicate with the developers, with the engineers, with human resources, with the system administrators. So the difficulty, I would say, is a personnel matter. That's probably the 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 greatest struggle, and that's the most frequent struggle. Is not having somebody on staff who understands these NIST requirements, who's able to distill the NIST requirements in such a way that non-cybersecurity professionals can understand them. So I think that's probably the most frequent struggle is a personnel related struggle. And then the second part of that question, how can small and medium-sized companies still achieve compliance with the limited resources? Hey, just contact IBSS. Um, in addition to that, contact IBSS. In order to still achieve compliance with limited resources, I do recommend if you just don't have the budget for full-time staff, you probably do want to outsource that because you want, when it comes to compliance, and we're talking about DoD contractors here. This is a line of business that's very important to you. So you want to ensure that you are compliant all of the time. So the recommendation there, if you don't have the personnel, and as the question is phrased, limited resources. Now I'm assuming we're saying limited human resources. If that's the case, you probably want to outsource that. Let's say it's a limited budget, then again, you probably want to consult an organization who can give you an idea about some cost-effective means to remain compliant and secure at the same time. And here's another question. Do all of the requirements have to be fulfilled by an organization? Are there any consequences of not implementing all of the requirements? So I will break that question up into two. So do all of the requirements have to be fulfilled by an organization? Um, I'll say yes, and then I'll say no. The answer is yes, they must be fulfilled. And here's the reason why the answer would be no. Because there are some requirements that might not be applicable, right? So if there are requirements that are not applicable to your organization, you do not have to fulfill those. So as I mentioned, using an example earlier, let's say the requirement is to protect digital media, but you have outsourced your media protection controls to a cloud service provider. Um, you, the organization, are not fulfilling that requirement specifically. However, you have outsourced it. So in your SSP, you want to make sure that you annotate that. Um, Again, you want to annotate your rationale for why your organization does not have to fulfill it, but you also want to specify who is fulfilling it in that instance. And then the second part of the question is, are there any consequences of not implementing all of the requirements? Um, that will depend. Yes, there are consequences, um, and that will depend on, especially when CMMC comes into play, the organization who will. It will depend on the organization who determines whether or not you pass and are certified. Um, Now, for the most part, you want to make sure that certainly all requirements are fulfilled. In some rare instances, you'll be able to create a POAM or a plan of action and milestones. But I would not venture into this endeavor. Trying to identify requirements that do not have to be implemented. So for the purpose of due diligence, strive to fulfill all requirements. And if you are unable to do so today, then that's when you develop that plan of action and milestone to help whoever the authorities are. They will see that you have a plan to fulfill those requirements. And we have another question. What steps can you take to keep a system security plan current and compliant with changing NIST SP 871 requirements, especially in an organization with a sprawling and ever-shifting IT environment? So let's see. What steps can you take to keep the SSP current and compliant with the changing 871 requirements? So 871 is now on version 3, and that revision was published in May of this year. Um, Rev 2 was published a few years prior to that, and the original version a few years prior to that. So the good thing is that these requirements are not changing monthly and not even yearly so far. So that's the good thing. So what you want to do whenever there is a new revision, um, you want to perform a gap analysis um, and determine the changes to 800-171 and determine whether or not you have you need to update your your security plan. So I would say then the steps. The question is, what steps can you take? Well, step one is the gap analysis, um, to compare what you have today compared to that subsequent revision of 800-171, and then just make the updates. Now, I say just make the updates as if that's a simple task. It's not always that simple because the update might require um, acquisition of new technology. So what you certainly want to do is make sure that you do that gap analysis and possibly even create a POAM at that moment to let the organization know that we need to take a structured approach to fulfill the new requirements. Question here. So what are some common pitfalls organizations face when creating and maintaining SSP, and how can we avoid them? Common pitfalls. One of the things that I've seen um, with organizations is not um, fully responding to the requirement. So we saw in that one example, 3.1.8, where for unsuccessful logons, there were like what 3 or 4 different requirements there that need to be met. So we have the overall requirement, but then each of those requirements, not each, several requirements in 800-171 um, have sub requirements. So what I've what I've seen is organizations they they think they've addressed the requirement, but they really have not, because if there are let's say 4 sub requirements, they've only addressed 2 of them. So that's a very common pitfall. Another um, pitfall that I've seen where, believe it or not, you might have somebody who is responsible for documenting the controls, but they don't really um, interact with the personnel who are responsible for implementing the controls. So, for example, you might have a cybersecurity professional who's documenting how certain systems are configured, but they haven't spoken to the person who configured it, right? So that's a common pitfall. So you need to make sure that that communication is taking place within the organization. Next question. Are organizations required to document the controls provided by a CSP? So are organizations required to document the controls provided by a cloud service provider? I will say this very delicately. Um, we should not document the controls provided by our CSP. Um, Quite often, when we have a cloud service provider, um, they tell us how they are protecting our information. Um, They will provide you with access to their system security plan. But in order to get that access, we typically have to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. So it's for that reason you don't want to document how the CSP has implemented the control. What you can simply state is a phrase like, we inherit this control from, and then the name of that cloud service provider. And that should be sufficient. So then when it's time for your organization to undergo an assessment, you won't get dinged for not having control implemented. And then you can direct the assessor to to where you all can work out how they can validate whether or not the CSP is providing adequate protection for your system. Next question. How would you approach SSP revisions following a security incident? My recommendation there is, as a part of the after action, if you have a security incident, your incident response plan should include a series of after action meetings and at least an after action report. As a part of that, those after action activities, um, whoever's involved in authoring SSP, they should be taking a part of that in those meetings and trying to determine which controls might have failed. So in that instance, that would be the way to revise the SSP. And again, that gets back to communication. You want to make sure that all parties who need to know are involved. So again, there's an incident, and this the analysis is done during those after action activities, and you want a part of that analysis is to identify which controls likely need to be strengthened. So that's the recommendation there, to revise the SSP after a security incident. Now, one of the things that I would like you to do is to kind of take a look at that QR code. Oh, wait a minute. I see we have one more question. Let's see. No, I think that's it. I don't think we have any more questions. So I do want to thank you for taking time out of your day to watch today's webinar. Be sure to click on the QR code to view the white paper, and do join us for our next live presentation where we'll be discussing the NIST SP 800-171 Plan of Action and Milestones. And also, feel free to send an email to NIST_SP800-171 at IBSScorp.com for a free consultation. Again, thank you for watching.